In part 2 of Notice and Note, we really take you deeply into the signpost lessons and try to explain how we found them and what it is they help students think more about as they're reading. Now, back in a previous little clip, we told you the story of how we came to begin thinking about the signposts. But what we really didn't do was talk about the criteria that we established for ourselves and the anchor questions. So let's start, Bob, by talking just a little bit about the 3 criteria that we established after we found that very first one, that tough questions that was in all of the books.
Well, we might have entitled this section Some of the Signposts We Found.
That's true.
Because we found a lot. We found, at one point, I think we were up to 12 or 13 signposts, features of a text that we thought might be noticeable and might lead to reflection that would tell you something about your reaction to the text or about the structure of the text. But we began to think about that long list of 13 and decided...
Well, actually, we had a teacher who helped us. When we showed her the long list, she said, "Are you kidding me?" She said, "You want kids doing this independently, and now you want them to hold all 12 of these in their heads?" She said, "You're not working with my kids, are you?"
But we couldn't remember them either.
Yeah,
so
that was part of the problem. I kept saying, what are they?
We realized that if we couldn't remember our own discoveries in these texts,
then we needed to
the kids weren't going to remember them either. So we decided we needed to narrow this list down to those that were most powerful. And one of our criteria, probably the single most important criterion, was that they show up in every young adult novel we read. We wanted these signposts to be reliable. We wanted them to be there to be found virtually in any young adult book.
Let me pop in with that because he's making a real important point. We've been reading books that might be read grades 4 and up. We stepped back and we read some picture story books, especially picture story books that really do have round characters like Lily's Purple Plastic Purse and Chrysanthemum, characters that develop and change over time. So we were looking later at some picture story books for our younger kids, but we really weren't trying to find these in adult fiction. We were really looking at children's literature and young adult literature. And so when you say they had to show up there, that's because we haven't actually looked at adult literature yet to see where they'll be. And we think there'll be some differences, but that was one of them, one of the criterion that it had to be there in every book across every genre. Yeah.
So the 6 that we settled on...
are you going to finish the criteria?
I can.
Okay, you should.
The second of the criteria we applied was simply that the feature, the text feature that we identified had to yield some significant insight into the text. It had to be useful. It had to tell the reader something about the text. And we found that these 6 signposts we finally agreed upon did do that. For instance, the tough question signpost almost always tells the student something about inner conflict. It will always tell you something about the problem of the novel, but it will almost always tell you something about the inner conflict the character has.
And Words of the Wiser is almost always going to give the reader insight into one of the critical lessons or themes that the author seems to be trying to promote in the book. So this another issue for us when we were looking for these was that the signposts we were finding had to help a kid think more deeply. And finally, it actually had to be something that the kids could see within the book. So it had to be concrete. So it had to occur across different grade levels, age ranges, genre. It had to have a visible, concrete thing in the text for the kid to see. And then once they saw it, it needed to take them deeper into the text. Those criteria are actually discussed on pages 67 and 68. And then you can see right there on page 68 the list of signposts, and of course they are there at the very beginning too. But Bob was right. Originally we had about 12 or 13. We had a teacher who said that's way too many. So we winnowed down to contrasting contradictions, aha moment, tough questions, words of the wiser, again and again, and memory moment. And then we began going into a couple of classrooms and teaching the lessons, especially contrasting contradictions. We knew we wanted to start with that one because that appears repeatedly in every book, not just once in a book. Words of the Wiser might appear just once in a book, but contrasting contradictions appear a lot. And it was actually Jen Ochoa, the teacher who's shown on the inside back cover and is mentioned repeatedly throughout this book, who pulled us out of the classroom while we were in the middle of teaching a contrasting contradictions lesson. And she took us out in the hall and she said, so guys, you've had kids figure out how to find contrast and contradictions on their own. And we said yes, and felt quite proud of ourselves, I think. And she said, but then you're ruining it because you, the two of us, were then following up by asking kids lots and lots of questions. We'd fallen into our own trap of thinking our questions will be better than anyone else's questions. And she said, kids need to be able to own these questions. They can't own all of these questions you're asking. Come up with one question that goes with each signpost, and let kids own that question. That was probably one of the most difficult intellectual challenges we had been against for a while. How do you craft a question that is both text specific and yet a kid can hold on to and take into lots of different places? So the next part that you'll read about in this part 2 section is really how we came to come up with those anchor questions and what it is we think those individual anchor questions do.
And as we came up with them, we had to wrestle with the temptation to keep expanding the list, because every time we'd come up with a question and apply it to a story, we would say to ourselves, there's so many other interesting questions to discuss about this story. But I think what we gradually learned was that if we can get the kids to take ownership of the one question, talking about it leads to a lot of those other questions. We don't have to raise them all. We can raise some because we can participate in the conversation too, but the kids themselves will raise many of those very sometimes particular and focused questions that we otherwise would have come up with.
Well, and one of my favorite stories that really illustrates that came from Akron, Ohio, I think. I forget the classroom, but a young man who had come into class late and at first seemed to not be very interested in what we were doing. You have to recognize that when Bob and I are in a classroom teaching, the kids see us as sort of just substitute teachers. They're not impressed by the number of books we've written or grants we've received or awards we've won. We are just substitute teachers at the front of the classroom. And this young man at one point said he had figured out that every time we stopped and had kids talk about the contrasts or contradictions they had found, that was the lesson we were teaching. We kept saying to them, why would the character act this way? And finally, he raised his hand and he said, are you people going to keep asking that question? And we said, yeah. And he said, same question? And we said, yeah. He said, every time you stop, it's the same question? We said, yeah. And then he looked at us, he said, they pay you a lot to ask that one question? And we said, sort of. And so we then finished the lesson, and after class he came up and he said, can I use that question in other classes? And we said, well, a little, it's why does the character act this way? If you're in social studies, you might have to say, why does the government act this way? Or if you're in science, you might say, why does the element act this way? You might have to change it a little. And he said, yeah, but mostly it's the same question. And we said, it is. And he said, I love that. And we said, why? And he said, I've always only known two things about school. The first, I'm not going to know the question that the teacher asks. He said, every time we stop, no matter what class we're in, every time we stop reading, the teacher has different questions to ask. And I'm never going to know what the question is. And he said, the second thing is, I'm never going to know the answer. And he said, I noticed that as we were going through this one story, because I could keep that one question in my head, that I could be thinking about it while I was reading, and this is going to change the way I read. A teacher asked us one time early on in some of the research for this, she said, does this mean we shouldn't be asking kids other questions? Absolutely not. Of course we want to ask kids other questions. We just think that if we, teacher, ask the questions all the time, we're not developing that habit of mind in the student to learn how to question the text. And so for our kids, and remember Bob and I are looking at really helping struggling readers. So for our kids who struggle with a text, we can't give them 25 questions to think about that they can own. We want to start them with one question, and it's what you just said. We know that one question will lead to many, many others. So the signpost is important, but it leads to the anchor question, and that's important. But what's critical is the conversation that comes out of finding that anchor, or finding things in the text that help you think about the anchor question. I'm Kylene Beers.
And I'm Bob Probst.